Hey everyone, I'm Alex Montero with Strongtown Chicago, and this is our Strongtown Chicago Speaker Series podcast, where we talk to educators, advocates, and public officials who are doing their part to make Chicago a stronger city. My guest today has been with the CTA for over a decade, came in as a lawyer, worked as chief of staff under the former president, and has been acting president of the CTA for the past year. We're going to talk a little bit about the state of the Chicago Transit Authority in the city, the role it plays in the city, some of the challenges it's had, some of the things it's working on, and things that are coming down the pipeline, and ways that people can better understand the CTA and the CTA can better understand the people in the city. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nora Leerhsen to the program. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So Nora, you have been with CTA for a little bit over a decade. Can you tell us prior to that, what made you interested in cities in general and transit specifically? What brought you here?
Absolutely. I started my career in public service over 20 years ago as a public school teacher. So I left college and joined the Teach for America program. And I taught in Compton. That's where I was trained to be a teacher, in Los Angeles. And then I taught for 2 years in Philadelphia. And I came to that work because I had always been interested in social justice and equity. It had always been an interest of mine. I looked into that program because I loved working with kids, but then also liked the idea that you committed this service to the country. You got stationed in a city in the country and then took that information to other leadership positions. So that was really incredibly formative, those years of teaching, because I showed up excited about making an impact, a bit young and naive about the realities of poverty and segregation and entrenched disinvestment in our country and what that looked like. So I knew it would be a challenging job, but the reality was I taught fifth grade. I taught all subjects. I had 30 students and we had no books. And I was making copies in the morning for students, here in the United States of America, right? It was that bad and that challenging. And that just woke me up to figuring out how to try to make cities and our country work better. And education is one way, but really I saw very profoundly how much it's everything. It's healthcare, it's transit, it's access to, basic needs that people need in cities in this country. And I got really passionate about that. So I actually went to graduate school after that to study history at the University of Chicago. And I studied civil rights history there with Professor Adam Green, who studies cities and civil rights in our country. And we traveled to Little Rock, Arkansas. We talked about the desegregation of Little Rock High School. I looked at letters that people wrote to the Chicago School Board in the 1960s and the way in which they articulated their resistance to proposals around busing and desegregation. I've always been really interested in not just black and white policy and, the law and the concrete law, but how it's getting implemented, how people are talking about it, the narrative around it, and how that impacts how it's actually played out. So I studied that there. I thought I might want to study history, but I didn't. I went back to teaching here in Chicago. I taught high school here in Chicago for a few years. I was also a college counselor. And then I went back to law school. If you're tracking this, I have a lot of student loans. So then I wanted to go back to school. I went to law school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As an older law student, I was 30 by then, and I wanted to understand policy, how it's written. I never wanted to bill an hour, and I never have. It was not that kind of law that I wanted to know. But I just wanted to make an impact with this experience that I had, this understanding of history and where we got here. And that's where I got an internship at the CTA as a law student. And what I worked on as a law student, one of the things was the background check policy in this country had just been updated to account for taking on other factors when you're assessing someone's criminal history in hiring to make sure it's not discriminatory against people who have had interactions with the justice system. And I was just inspired by the impact there, just looking at the example, an employer like CTA, who employs so many people, so many generations of people in the city, and to be able to, influence how that hiring occurs in the way that it's supposed to in a more just and fair way. I just saw immediately the impact that a place like CTA has. And then I was hired there and worked in compliance, which sounds very dry and boring, but you learn everything. So I ran audits of our entire system, of the maintenance of CTA, of the cleaning regimen of CTA. You learn every single department, and everything that happens at CTA is so impactful to people's lives, and that just became kind of an addiction for me. The broad impact that transit has, and I really think that when you look at the health of a city's transit system, when you look at the attention paid to a transit system, you're seeing how much that city and that community cares about disabled people. You're seeing how much it cares about low-income people, how much it cares about community, about connection. And it's really unmatched to me, the impact that transit has on people and the health of a city.
Mm-hmm. When you came into the role as acting president a little over a year ago, the CTA was in a tricky spot. The transit fiscal cliff was looming with COVID-era relief funds just about to run out. There were long issues with ghost buses, system performance, people concerned about safety and antisocial behaviors on trains. It was a tricky moment to step in for sure. How did you go about when you started figuring out what to put first and how to shape what was an important emergency priority versus what could afford to wait and be evaluated a little bit later?
Yeah, that's a great question. Since I had been chief of staff for 6 years, I saw everything happening right there. So I saw all the dynamics at play. I was very ready to step in and think about what people wanted to hear from a customer perspective. So I knew that faith in CTA, trust in CTA was primary and really had to be addressed. And I was excited to jump in to try to connect with the public in a deeper, more meaningful way, and to do it in a way that was personal to me as a daily rider and as someone that cares about this industry so much and about the CTA so much. And it was sort of like a light switch I just wanted to turn on. Like I say, I started my career wanting to be a leader. And so when the opportunity presented itself, there are two roles I think that are so close to one another, like a chief of staff role and a presidential role. They're right next to each other, but in many ways they could not be more different, because you're always supporting the principal. In the chief of staff role, the principal and the president, sets a tone once they're in that role. And so I turned on that light switch. I dove in. We had the fiscal cliff looming, which was very worrisome, and it was heavy for our agency. People rightfully want to stop talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, and I will, but I think for CTA and an agency that went through so much, I think it's really needs to be part of our history. It changed our agency deeply, kind of the chemistry and the makeup of who we are. We always knew at CTA we were important to the functioning of the city, but not having to shut down in the COVID-19 pandemic, sending our employees out into some of the most scariest parts of that, was a wake-up call of really what we are. We're emergency responders. We cannot shut down or people will die. People will not be able to access, life-saving services. So, I had gone through all that at CTA, and it had taught me a lot about who we are. And then we reached the fiscal cliff, and it was just, we got through the pandemic, thankfully, only to be faced by these threats that we were just going to kind of disappear. And, we were hiring furiously to get our service back up. So if you think about that dynamic, you're hiring at great rates with threats that you're just going to have to lay people off. It was very kind of unsettling as an agency. So to have that behind us is huge, but to lead through that was a big responsibility and something I took very seriously, that to have a steady hand, a belief in the positivity of the future for CTA. We did things like the frequent network last year, where we put in place 20 routes across the city, looking to have 10-minute or better service all day long. And we still built that out last year. And, there were naysayers that said, slow down, you might run out of money. Why are you trying to grow right now? And And I knew that that was part of it. We need to move forward, grow, have faith that the legislators are going to come through. But it was also for the public and for the employees to know that we were strong, we were growing, and to be able to set that tone was critical. And of course, at CTA, you're doing that while having to deliver service 24 hours a day, right? Nonstop. So you can't lose sight of really our core function is to move people safely around the city, right? And I started actually in the safety department at CTA. I said compliance, but it was in the safety department, and not security, not crime, but transit safety. And that's always been the number one goal. You don't hear about that as publicly, but we talk about every day about any rail safety incident, bus safety incident, the integrity of our tracks, the maintenance of our vehicles so that they're running safely. So you're always keeping that humming really strongly to ensure you're safely moving people. But then, I leaned in to the rest of the parts of the leadership. Even in a very scary year, we started a podcast.
Right.
We did a partnership with Chance the Rapper, and we celebrated who we are too. And what was profound for me was realizing that the leader is who can do that, and nobody else really can. They can open that door to celebration and optimism, even in a challenging time. And when I felt that when I do that, then other people can follow, there was no turning back.
Mm-hmm. The CTA Connections YouTube channel, as you mentioned, you've by now done a couple of podcast episodes, video podcast episodes with Chance the Rapper, with Six Figure Dilla, Chicago historian, a couple other folks at CTA who have led initiatives like the Red Purple line modernization. What role do you see media and communicating with the public in those ways instead of or in addition to traditional press briefings and those kinds of things? What role do you see that has in helping CTA inform the public of what it's doing and bringing people along to what the vision is?
Yeah, I think it plays a huge role. I think at first glance it can look sort of, and it is fun. It can look like, just kind of sitting around talking about transit. That sounds fun, but it's much more than that. It's a statement to the public of that we're healthy, we're strong, that we know what we mean to people. I mean, time after time, you hear about people move to this city for the CTA.
Right.
We all know the emotional hit that seeing the elevated run on a beautiful summer night in front of you has. And, taking the moment to get in touch with that for people is really powerful. And there's so much opportunity there. So that connection, first and foremost is that kind of tone connection that CTA, it doesn't mean we don't have challenges. It doesn't mean we can't make sure we're improving for people all the time. And we absolutely have to. But we're all in Chicago because of the CTA.
That's just part of the fabric of the city, right?
Absolutely.
One out of every 5 apartments has a CTA rail map poster on the wall, including mine.
It's the magic of our evenings, of our mornings. It's the seeing strangers amongst you in a rail car or a bus. Maybe the only time that people throughout their day kind of learn about people that aren't exactly like themselves and think exactly like them. Transit is magical in that way. And why not celebrate that and talk about it? And so I think that's a lot of what it is. I think it's also about Chicago. So CTA can be a stage upon which we can just talk about our city. And it's a really important time for cities, for urban centers in this country. It's a really important time to take pride in who we are and not just in reaction to bad things that are going on. I think that's an important thing, but something that's really meaningful for me, even with the Chance partnership, I saw it as almost a kind of performance art to be on the train together and have his music playing and to be celebrating with his fans on the Red Line, traveling all the way down to 95th Street. We created something, that before that day happened didn't exist before. And I think it's so important just in a challenging political moment, even to be creating and not just reacting and continuing to build out who Chicago is. And the CTA and being associated with that can let you do that in a way that very few things can.
You've also participated as a guest on a couple of transit-themed comedy shows recently. Ellen Steinke, who's one of our leads at Strongtown Chicago, organized that, first about the transit fiscal cliff and more recently about street safety. And I believe you used to do improv yourself. Is that right?
I did. I'm a graduate of the Second City Improv program. I did all the levels of it before I had kids, a while ago. But it was an incredible experience. And I actually think there's a lot of connection, a lot of similarities between the symbolism of the Second City and CTA and what it means to this city and its identity and the way it brings people together.
Yeah, the comedy to transit advocacy pipeline is wider than you would think, right?
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And comedy just allows you to talk about life in a certain way that other things cannot, and make you laugh about things that are heavy and talk about challenging topics together. But I think, I grew up in New York, so I didn't grow up in Chicago. And New Yorkers, frankly, can have a little bit of a snootiness about that they have the best theater, they have the best everything. Right. And they don't have the best comedy we do. Yeah. I mean, Second City made every great comedian out there. And so I have such pride that Second City's here. I also think it brings together people for those classes, the way it has a whole educational program that brings people at all different points in their life together. You don't have to be kind of enrolled in a real university program, but you're coming together and learning. It's incredible. And I actually did stand up following that. That's what I've done more recently, but paused while I've been in this role.
Right. And would you say that kind of exposure, having done both improv and stand-up, has helped in figuring out how do you communicate things effectively? How do you connect with people?
Oh, 100%. I actually took on improv when I started at the CTA because I had been a teacher for so long. And when you're a teacher, you're standing in front of the room and everyone's just supposed to listen to you. They don't always, but you're clearly the one in charge and you're dictating the room. And then when you transition to a work day with other adults and you're sitting around a table and you're at meetings and navigating, wait, when do I talk and when do they talk? I got kind of interested in that dynamic and freeing myself up more. And that's what improv gave me, practice and kind of letting loose, not being tongue-tied. And it was huge that way. Yeah.
In terms of from the city, you mentioned early on, part of why you got into this work is looking at equity, looking at opportunity, and looking at the way that transit, among other services, brings that to people. Chicago famously is a pretty segregated city, and that shows even in the way that our transit system functions, right? There are red line neighborhoods and blue line neighborhoods and pink line neighborhoods, and entire segments of certain lines where everybody looks a certain way until you cross a certain street and then the demographics shift. And at the same time, the buses and the transit system is one of the few things that connects all of those different neighborhoods, right? Something like the Western bus that goes north to south across a whole bunch of wards and demographic slices across the entire city. How do you see the CTA playing a role in helping to, over time, build a more connected city and a city where there isn't some of those big gaps and disparities that we've seen of even from life expectancy between the south side and the north side or between property values and those things?
Yeah, there's massive opportunity in investing in CTA and building out our service to make an impact on those issues that other things cannot even so quickly make that impact. We have the ability to get into communities, to provide service, to give people a sense of opportunity and access that nothing else really can in that way. I say about our bus system, it really shows how much you're invested in equity, because the rail system, you can sort of say, well, we need a big project to extend that rail system. It is what it is. Your bus system, you can change your service pretty quickly and run more frequent service to communities next week if you wanted to. And so it keeps you honest about how much you really care about giving people access and allowing people to get to jobs, to school in an affordable way that's reliable and frequent is, a civil right for people. And what could be more important than people being able to get to their job on time? It's a very serious responsibility. People are using us to access those ways to pay for their rent and support their children. So, every investment you make in CTA, because of how interconnected we are, is an investment in equity. We're an incredibly affordable way to get around. So when you invest in us, like we got with the transit bill, you are investing in equity. But then you have to plan in a right way that's fair. So, the red line extension is huge in that way. It's going to be a massive historical moment for CTA. But it's not just building it. I think that project gets discussed as if it's kind of over, and it hasn't even started. And yes, that rail system is set up for the plan it is, but now it's on everybody else and the rest of all the industries and the business community to invest and develop around those stations to have it have the impact that it could. And it's just starting. I think we should just be beginning to think about how to regionally connect to those stations. This is just an example, how to build up development around those stations. And everybody needs to step up to make that investment worth what it is. And that's just one example. But, our frequent bus network, we put together absolutely with equity in mind to make sure it was balanced and the communities that needed regular frequent bus access get those benefits. And it's things like not just looking at ridership to decide where you're investing. And that's another thing that from the top and as a policy leader, asking those questions can have that impact. So a bus route, perhaps in an underinvested neighborhood, you invest in service, it doesn't necessarily mean ridership is immediately going to shoot up in the same way that it would in a community where you have a higher population, a more active population that has jobs to get to, that has more privilege, frankly.
It's that trade-off between ridership and coverage,
yes,
right, that Jarrett Walker has discussed.
Yes. And telling people, let's hold on, invest in a bus route doesn't mean you're going to see the ridership necessarily shoot up right away, but it's about that potential and that they deserve that potential for that ride down the road. And they don't always have to prove that the ridership is there right away just to invest in it. And making those decisions is how you make sure you're uplifting communities in the way you should.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about Red Line Extension and projects like it. The Red Line Extension has, as you mentioned, been a long time coming. It was originally proposed decades ago and has a lot of potential benefits to the communities along those corridors and connectivity to the rest of the system. It's been criticized for cost ballooning, that being the big elephant in the room, that the estimated cost has grown to the point where, if completed, I think it would be one of the most expensive projects per mile. So given that these projects are important and that expanding the system and bringing it to more people is so critical, how can CTA plan for the future to make sure that it's getting as much rail or as much ability to deliver service for each dollar it puts in as possible? What are some things that the CTA could do to build institutional capacity so that future projects like this can be done closer to what the Orange Line cost back in the 90s instead of what the Red Line Extension is projected to cost now?
Yeah, it's a complex question. There's a lot of reasons you see a big price tag on a project like that. And there's a lot of contributing factors. Some of it is the reality of infrastructure costs in our country overall that you'll see there. Some of it is the timeline around the pandemic and the way in which the price was one thing and then later evolved to a higher price. That's not unique to this project. That's true of every project that was kind of put together around that time. But, I talked about studying the way people talk about projects. Mm-hmm. And I do think not everyone, but the way we talk about this project, we have to be careful because I worry people are abandoning it already. Mm-hmm. I worry people are sort of critiquing it in a way that we've seen happen before with investments in disinvested communities, as opposed to stepping up and committing to making that price tag worth what it is. But I also think something to consider when you say long-term planning and weighing other factors, rightfully so, CTA service is highly scrutinized. Mm-hmm. And people are watching it, tracking it. And something that's important to me is making sure the public and everyone understands contributing factors as to why the blue line might be slow,
Right.
and why we have slow zones, right? And that is not to say there aren't management decisions that are impacting service. Absolutely not. We should actually be more sophisticated in the way that we're talking about what category those are. And it's something I'm working on internally, versus when you see a delay that's impacted by older tracks, by older rail cars, and making sure, to your question, that we're asking for funding around those things to make sure that we're fairly investing in our system throughout the system. So, yes, the red line extension is key as one type of project, but we also need to keep investing in our tracks on the blue line, and frankly, making that type of investment as sexy as a new extension, right? And
maintenance never makes headlines.
Right. But that's critical, right? And I know there's concern. I know when people bring up the price of a project, they're also saying, well, what does that mean for the investing in the slow zones on the blue line or in other parts? And it's a valid question. We need to make sure we're looking at all of those investments. And part of that is making sure that when we talk about CTA service and what's impacting it, you're not letting CTA off the hook by acknowledging that some of that is really old track and really old rail cars that need to be invested in, and then supporting project investments when those come along in that way too, and making sure that we're balancing those investments.
Mm-hmm. Is there also an interest in the agency to see some potential to do things in-house that traditionally have been done by consultants, in part contributing to some of the uncertainty over some of these costs? I think when people look at transit agencies, not so much in the States, the U.S. struggles with this, but especially in other parts of the world, a lot of times, a lot of the design of stations and the standards and those things tend to be done by in-house staff. What role does that play into it, of potentially maybe investing a little bit up front in building the capacity to do certain kinds of projects so that you can do more of them in the future, instead of having to bring in a third party and relearn from scratch every time?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, as you're talking, I also think it's, first of all, no matter who you're working with, in-house or external, being transparent and updating the public with projects of interest as to what the plans are, making sure you're engaging with them very closely. And that's an important part, so that there's not news later on in the process, or people understand how we got to a decision that we did. But I agree with you. I mean, I think we haven't brought up the Northern Illinois Transit Authority yet.
Yes.
But I think this is an interesting opportunity to talk about planning in a new way, in the way that you're talking about too. So when we think more regionally about planning and have that centralized in NEDA, is there opportunity there to build that type of institutional knowledge in a new way that creates increased transparency and further understanding of the plan around our projects in a way that, like you say, perhaps doesn't repeat learning lessons, but also just has a larger, more long-term, more regional understanding of where we're headed.
Mm-hmm. With NEDA, which I'm glad you brought up, NEDA was created to replace RTA as part of the Transit Fiscal Cliff Package, and additional funding given to CTA, PACE, and Metra. There were some governance reforms there, and some ways that it will both have some additional powers to potentially take a longer term role in seeing how the agencies interact with each other and projects that overlap with each other, and also even things potentially like land development around stops, transit-oriented development. As NEDA is shaping up right now and sort of getting built up and staffed this year, what do you see NEDA's relationships with the CTA being, and how do you think that will be similar or different to what CTA's relationship with the RTA, Regional Transit Authority, was?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating time right now, thinking about all those changes. And first of all, for me, all of this attention on transit, I think, is fantastic. From the legislators across different levels of government, even the news media, all this attention on this moment for transit, I think, is so beneficial. I think transit can sometimes be an afterthought, and in terms of policymaking. And so I have so much optimism about this moment for transit because of all of the thought and discussion going on around it. In terms of the difference between RTA moving forward, I mean, we're seeing a really heavy focus on regional coordination, making sure that when we make big purchases as an agency, we are working in close coordination with Metro and Pace to make sure there's not only cost savings that could be available to contracts that we do, but also just, planning knowledge that comes together. And I also think that's a great thing when we think about building out how to, we all have similar dynamics of talking with customers, thinking about what people want from a transit ride. And we do connect currently, but I think the focus on kind of really putting a foot on the gas on that type of work will take a region like Chicago that has an incredible amount of intellect and sophistication and just kind of supercharge the knowledge that we have around planning from a transit perspective. I think it's still kind of in transition. So I think that exactly the way the dynamic works, we've yet to experience. But I do think the intense intention on providing better service for people, safer transit for people, is just a great goal to have as a region. And I really look forward to it.
Yeah. And I think also seeing it as part of a coherent ecosystem, not separate systems with separate riders, right? A lot of us, myself included, have family out in the suburbs. When we go see them, we take Metro out to do that. Within the city, we mostly work with CTA. If we're in some near suburb, we take Pace. So the same person is a rider on each one of those systems. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it stands out how clunky the transitions between them are, right? Even where we are in Ravenswood, where there is a Metro stop, and you have to sort of sprint a couple of blocks down to get to the nearest Brown CTA stop, even though they go next to each other for a little bit. So there are potentially opportunities to not just learn from each other institutionally, but also make it so it functions more like a consolidated network so that people can shift between it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a big focus on a seamless system and, figuring out where those clunky connections exist and making them smoother. It's just going to produce, better communication with riders, giving people a sense of moving across a more vast area using public transit as opposed to maybe taking an Uber so far and then getting on public transit, and just further getting people out of cars. I mean, what that means is a better climate, a better experience, for our entire region. So the outcomes in that are so positive. So I think it'll be a really interesting time to be focused on that.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned investments around existing transit infrastructure, especially rail, since it has a lot of capacity. What do you see as a positive way for the CTA as a transportation provider to interact with some of the other land use policy in the city, zoning, land use planning, corridors, upzoning? It seems like there's a few examples of a big investment being made in improving service or modernizing stations or making them more accessible. And then the land use kind of struggles to pick up with it. I think the recent upzoning in Edgewater and all of the contention around that, where CTA invested a lot to modernize stations, but then nearby neighbors didn't actually want new homes to go in so people could take advantage of that. What role does CTA play in helping that dynamic be more positive and less contentious? And what are ways that the city or aldermen or people who work on the land use side of things could help make better use of the system we have?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, there's a ton of opportunity there. So I'll tell you, my first reaction when I hear questions like that is to say, my job and our job at CTA is to run a world-class, well-functioning, reliable, safe, clean system that's kind of a bright and shining example of why you would develop around us, right? I think sometimes we get kind of weighed down by a lot of our challenges, and then the benefit of investing around transit is lost a little bit. So I think, first of all, it's just being a super healthy, strong system so that when you go to those conversations about the value of creating policy to promote development around transit and more housing and linking that closely there, then you've got people excited about what that means in the way they should be. And, it's partnership with the right departments across the city, with the Department of Planning and Development, with the aldermen, and, constantly talking about the benefit of transit to your neighborhood, creating more walkable, more livable communities, making sure people have those stories, that language to uplift the policies they're working on, and not making transit get that kind of value and weight to it so that those policies move, right? I think sometimes, it's just kind of too disconnected, and you've got kind of transit lovers that want those policies, and then there's everybody else, and starting to broaden out that concept to making people see what it means to the city overall too, that it's not just a pro-transit concept, but it improves, the climate in the city, the economy for the entire city overall, making sure people have that data of the benefit of these types of policies to promote those policies. And that comes a lot from CTA, given our industry. So, I really think it's uplifting the system, and then having the right partnerships and with the right people to make those policies happen.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, making it so that people see the value of this, even if they are not regular riders of the system itself, of the buses or of the trains.
Yes,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot. Even I was talking about this about bus lanes, for example, and the resistance that you can have to putting in a bus lane in front of a business, for example, and removing the parking. Let's broaden out, right? Let's get off of that block of just talking about those couples parking spots, and have that business owner see that the health of our bus system means you have more customers, you have more potential employees, you have a thriving city that picks your business up in a way much more beyond those 2 parking spots in front of your business. And that takes work. I think,
loss aversion is very powerful.
Yeah. And I believe a lot in storytelling and getting narratives that people have to talk about. And that's a lot. You asked about communication around CTA, but that's not that easy to do. You have to build that out to kind of explain that to people, whether or not you're on the bus. This is something that uplifts our whole city in a way that will help your business, and in a way that's very impactful.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about safety for a little bit. It's one of those areas where even folks who don't ride the CTA regularly have opinions weigh in, perceive how healthy the system is and what role it plays in the city. Broadly speaking, I think safety falls into a couple of categories, right? There's violent crime and assault, which I think nobody disagrees with, trying to find ways to reduce that. And then there's antisocial behavior, right? I think what I want to ask is, one, when people talk about crime on the CTA in general, how do you think those two things interact with each other, and how can we have a good conversation about what that actually means, and how heavily to weigh things in those couple of categories? And two, what are things that the CTA can meaningfully do to improve safety, and that the city can also, and advocates can do to improve safety on the system, including things like police service and security, but also things like design and eyes on the street, and those other factors that affect how safe a system is and feels to the people who ride it.
Yeah, I think the breadth of your question speaks to the breadth of the solutions and things that come up around this issue. To your first question around antisocial behaviors as they connect to more serious crimes.
Graffiti, smoking on the trains, jumping the turnstiles.
Right, yeah. We do know from data and just from clear experience that those things can be connected, that if someone fare evades, they are more likely to also commit another crime on CTA, that those things can be connected. I think also just from a perception aspect of a rider, when they are aware or hear stories of more serious crime on CTA and then experience an antisocial behavior, the psychological experience can be stressful because they connect the two. And I think, the numbers of people who are actually victims of serious crime on CTA are thankfully low. But the reality is that people can worry that they will be, because they see media stories, they see notable events, and then they see someone acting away. Smoking on a CTA train seems pretty antisocial. and then it makes them uneasy. So I think a lot about the psychology of being a rider on CTA. I'm on the CTA constantly myself, so I know that feeling myself, that it's just can make you uneasy if someone is not respecting the space of the CTA in a way that seems appropriate. And so you have to deal with it all, though, and which means you have to bring a ton of different concepts and ideas to the table. Security is something, I've been in the president's office for 8 years because I started at in other roles before chief of staff, and I've always worked closely on security. So this subject is very personal and near and dear to me, and thinking about all the dynamic aspects you have to bring to it. So police certainly are in many ways at the center of the issue. We have a very strong relationship with the police right now at CTA. The superintendent is a very strong partner and leader with CTA in terms of putting in different types of missions. So we have a vast system. I think people talk a lot about coverage of any type of resource. You have to think about the size of our system. And, you can think 146 stations, 127 bus routes. It sounds like a lot, but if you actually think about the amount of vehicles we have out there, the amount of actual rail cars. So in a given afternoon rush hour, we have over 1,000 individual rail cars running, right? We have over 1,500 buses. This is a massive amount of space to cover. So first thinking about that, you have to be smart about where you are putting eyes on the street, where you are putting resources, because it's massive to cover in any one moment. And so we've tried to be really strategic about the work that we're doing. So we do have a code of conduct like transit agencies do. And we on the Blue Line, we've been doing code of conduct work with our security guards and with the police. And, that's meant to address those kind of antisocial behaviors, make sure people are acting in a way that's appropriate. We have seen crime on the Blue Line. Actually, to your question, crime overall on the Blue Line has decreased 16% in 2025 compared to 2024. So to kind of turn your question around, when you address those antisocial behaviors through the code of conduct discussion, you'll see an impact on crime numbers overall. So they are related. The presence is important just on a system that is so big, just a sense that people are out and about on the system, watching one another, looking out for each other has been huge. And so there's law enforcement, but we've done more than ever in non-law enforcement ways as well. So, I watched for a long time at CTA, a lot of arguments from previous leadership, previous people around this issue. We're a transit system. This isn't our job to do anything but run trains and buses. And that is our focus, but we have to take responsibility for what happens on our system. And that doesn't mean we are police, but it means to me that we bring everyone to the table. We facilitate a conversation in a way that only we can, where we talk about what happens on our system and the reality of it. It's also a very unique environment that, we're running live service on an electrified third rail 24 hours a day. This is a unique, area to patrol, no matter who you are.
And it's one of the few areas where anybody has a legal right to be if they're swiped in. There's not a whole lot of places in any city that are public in that way.
Yeah. Or that are public in that way, that are open 24 hours a day, that are low cost. And what that means is we see everything, right? And I try to tell my employees that that's challenges, but they should be quite proud of that. I think there's a lot of honor in running a system that opens its doors 24 hours a day and takes that on and then continues to run service through it. That's something that's noble work. That's really important work. And, from a non-law enforcement perspective, we at CTA, we're doing pilots right now. Very actively, we're starting a pilot both in nonviolence, violence interrupters, and crisis intervention. So it's small scale, but we want to start trying out that activity on the CTA, seeing what it would look like if we have crisis intervention individuals on the system, how they would respond. Because you can kind of say that's a good idea, but you need to actually see the nitty gritty of it. What does that look like when an incident creates itself? Literally, how does it get called in to the control center? What words do you use to get the right people to respond? And that takes work to put that together. And so we're building that out this year to make sure we're thinking about how to do that really effectively. I know the NETA bill has transit ambassadors as a concept, and we want to come to the table in planning those with this experience of running different types of non-law enforcement work on CTA. To your point about eyes on the street and people around, our employees too are key to that. They are so critical to our city's health, and they're part emergency responder, they are part transit worker, they're everything, right? They're part therapists for people, all while operating vehicles and cleaning vehicles. So they're a huge part of making an ecosystem on CTA that's inviting and safe, and also are a huge aspect of the group that needs to be kept safe and comfortable.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask about what Chicago can learn from other cities that have made strides in transit, particularly other cities in the U.S. and Canada. I feel like in Chicago, we're sometimes guilty of Chicago and exceptionalism, thinking that we're the best city in the world because we are, and we're special, and so the rules from other places don't apply. But there are a lot of cities that have made some pretty big strides redesigning the way their bus networks work in recent years, embracing things like light rail and other forms of getting people around. What are some things that you think we can learn from other U.S. cities that weren't known for transit at all, maybe a decade or two ago, but that have done and built up some of those capabilities, and maybe we could try bringing some of those things here to Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, this was known to transit, but I mean, first and foremost for me is getting up to speed, no pun intended, on our bus street infrastructure. Our city has an enormous way to go on that front. We only have 13 bus lanes for a city our size. We got to have more, and we have to work together to put that together. And it doesn't need to be bus rapid transit level necessarily, although we should be continuing to look for those corridors. But we should also be more nimble and ready to implement street treatments that keep our buses moving. I mean, you see New York moving in a way that supports bus street infrastructure. For a city that complex, we should be able to do something as well. And not making perfect the enemy of the good. So trying something out, getting buses flowing in a more active way. Really, so many cities are ahead of us on that front.
And those are things like jump lanes, signal priority.
Yeah, bump outs, ways to make sure that people can get on the bus more quickly, keep service flowing. In a lot of ways, we've kind of dipped our toe. We have transit signal priority in certain corridors in Chicago, but nowhere near as many as we should. We started automated bus lane enforcement last year, but on only a few buses. We need to expand that to make sure that delivery trucks and aspects keep our bus lanes clear. So that comes to mind very much for me always, first and foremost. I'd say also connecting with our bikes and creating a better bike infrastructure that connects into the system is also a focus of mine. You see cities like Minneapolis really support bikes and in a way that I think we can continue to do. Cities like Portland make it just easy to pay for bike usage and transit usage just more seamlessly. We have a lot of growth in that area that we can do at CTA and across the region. And I'd say also, a city like Paris has really struck me in terms of what it's achieved. I studied there as an undergrad, what feels like forever ago. And then I went back this past summer. I went with a group of Midwest transit leaders to talk with their transit system and leaders in Paris, because they've made incredible strides in terms of removing parking and creating more support for transit, for biking, more greenery on the streets in a way that is quite moving. And their climate impact has been stunning in terms of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions just in the past even 6 years in Paris. And, when you see a city that kind of ancient be able to do that, we should be able to do those kinds of things here. So that was quite inspiring for me to see Paris in that way, and to realize that when leadership pushes things, you can get people out of cars in a way that's quite transformational.
Mm-hmm. What about things like finding sort of the middle part between what is the bus network and the heavy rail L network, right? I think a number of cities have embraced things like orbital light rail, right, to do those circuitous circle or cross-town routes in ways that there's enough ridership that even the double bendy buses isn't cutting it anymore with bunching, but it's not something that you could justify or quickly enough build a full additional subway or L line. Are there ways that CTA is looking at those things or planning for that at some point in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything's on the table, especially, again, in talking about the post-pandemic world, and people are still moving in a way that's very different than most of history in terms of the change in commute patterns.
Right.
I think we're still figuring out how this settles in 100% in terms of the way that we move. But what it means is that people, to your point, there may be opportunities to think about new ways of access that are beyond the kind of 9 to 5 crunch of commuters that we've really seen through all of our city's history, right? And looking at, we even see, when we look at our ridership, the midday ridership, the times are so different still, right? You still have generally the rush and peak, but it has changed a lot. So I think it is time to look at, so if people are using transit in a different way, for leisure in a different way, and the access points, especially from a regional perspective, we should absolutely think about those things. And I think the time is now to do that. We're doing a review of our bus system, to your point, to look at what is more nimble, that can be changed and adjusted to our riders. And I think we should look at those other types of rail that may not take as much of a grand investment, but still connect people in a way that meets this unique need.
Mm-hmm. And for things like how to squeeze more out of the existing system, you've mentioned about how to speed the buses up through things like priority at intersections, jump lanes, bus lanes. What role does something like bus stop consolidation play in this? I think there's been a good amount written about how Chicago has some of the closest stop spacing just because of the nature of the grid, right? Compared with a lot of other peer cities. There are a couple of corridors in the city that have moved away from that, Ashland and Western, where the spacing is now every 2 blocks instead of every block, and those work significantly faster that way, partly because they're some of the busiest routes in the city, right? And they if they didn't do that, they probably wouldn't be able to function at all. Is there space to see where does it make sense to do that in other parts of the city and revisit the assumptions about how separate do we space bus stops? And is it better to have them a little bit farther apart but make the bus come more frequently versus save somebody a minute walking to their nearest stop?
Yeah, I know it's come up. It's a really interesting question. I think what comes up first and foremost when you're talking about that is that when you remove a bus stop, you're making it harder for some people to access a bus stop, right? Who really rely on it not being that far away. People with limited mobility issues come to mind first. So there's a lot of security that people take in a sense that their bus stop is close no matter what. That being said, the criticality of that issue is because it can be so hard to move on our city's sidewalks and streets and access them. Right. So all of these things are very connected. If it's easier to move from one place to another in the city on the sidewalk or street infrastructure as it is, then making it a little bit longer to get to a bus stop is less impactful to that person. These things are all connected. So I think when you're seeing that type of really worrisome reaction to the consolidation of bus stops, it speaks to not just the bus system, but access overall from our street infrastructure. So I think you have to be really kind of targeted and use a scalpel to do that in a way that keeps in mind kind of who in that specific community may not be able to access something. I think it has to be really fine-tuned to make sure you're not keeping people off the system who rely on it and really rely on it being that much closer.
Mm-hmm. One question I have for you broadly is, what's something that you're working on right now that you're excited about and you'd like other people to know about?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think the NETA work is really exciting. I'd say, that's really changed this job. it's changed this work, right? The meetings I'm at every single day about what this looks like from a regional perspective. So I'd say that's absolutely front and center. But I'm also working on a project, and I've talked about this, but putting in children's furniture around CTA. It's just kind of one example of moving beyond just kind of keeping the lights on, washing things, which is important. We're still doing that. But then also creating ways to make CTA seem even more inviting and celebrating our riders of all ages and all kinds. That's actually something I also saw in Paris, where they were putting child-sized benches just on the street. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, right? Just to make a child feel like they're particularly welcome in this place and that it's for them.
Yeah, tactical urbanism placemaking. Right?
Yes, yeah. So we've got some cute kind of animal-shaped benches that are going to be coming around some of our stations. And as a mom of little kids, I'm just really excited about that. I think also really pushing forward the continuous art and celebration on CTA. We're looking to be doing performance on CTA in a new way. Maybe some comedy might be coming on CTA. I've been researching how to do that. I've seen other systems do it actually, and solved a big problem that I was trying to think of, where people actually have headphones on where you can hear the person performing, so that even when the train is running. Right. So hopefully that's going to brew up a little bit this year. Yeah.
Nice. And one final question. What one piece of advice would you give to people who are passionate about transit, who want to help it work better, and who see the CTA and some of the stuff the city is doing and are like, that's cool, but I don't see where I fit into it? What's an opportunity for advocates to advocate and help nudge things in the right direction?
Yeah, well, I think you're quite a symbol of it. I have been so impressed by the advocacy community around transit over the years that I've seen, and how pure and committed it is. The way in which you meet regularly and talk about these issues. I cannot tell you, I think, how impactful that was in getting the transit bill passed. I saw it from where I sit, that, you observe legislators in all different types of scenarios, but there was real passionate, cheerful pressure on the legislature to pass that bill. And I was quite awed by it. So I would first make sure people know the impact they have. And I've told Ellen of, the Safe Streets show and the Second City work that made an impact. It was very politically savvy to be bringing electeds in there and laughing with them and talking about the need and how important it is. So I would tap in, frankly, to your network, the Strong Towns Network, the work that all of you are doing, and, continue to promote when you see something going well too. I think that's an important aspect of building out a strong community. I also think that kind of positive focus on transit and what it produces that the fiscal cliff created, to continue to capitalize on that. I'm really big on taking that energy around the funding that we got and applying it to improving transit. And I said that at the Safe Streets show, but let's now roll all that same energy, all those same people into the stuff that we know needs to get done around here.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for being with us, Nora, and thank you for all your hard work at the CTA.
Thank you so much.